Thank you so much, Russ, and thank you to the entirety of the audience in FutureChurch, and especially to Deborah Rose, who extended this invitation to me. It's been a long day for me, so bear with me. Any day I have to teach, I'm always just out of sorts, but I'm very honored and grateful to be here in front of you to talk about some very difficult topics, especially topics that intersect current social justice issues, especially as they relate to sexual violence, racial injustice, and all the things that make us very uncomfortable in our communities today to talk about. So, and I think your introduction was very generous, Russell. Thank you so much. In January 1856, in the dead of winter, on the coldest of nights, Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman, and her entire family escaped from northern Kentucky. After traveling 16 miles with 4 small children and her 2 elderly in-laws, the family made it to Cincinnati, to a home not far from where you all are in Cleveland. Within hours of arriving, and as her owner tried to capture them, Margaret murdered her 2-year-old daughter and attempted to kill her other 3 children, including another baby girl. You can look deep into the history of enslavement, and you will find few stories like this one, as horrific as this one was. It is a particularly grisly story, one in which I document with great detail in my larger book. So I should say right here, full disclosure, again, these are very, very grisly details. And so I just want to prepare you before I move on. Garner's story is as uncomfortable as it is captivating, so much so that it has inspired several poems, novels, works of historical fiction, collected essays, a film, and even an opera. In her day, abolitionists, women's rights activists, and Black leaders like Frederick Douglass all applauded her actions. Margaret Garner was considered a hero by just as many people as considered her a villain at that time. And so, you know, it's really like we may judge her now, but at that time, a lot of people considered her a hero. Margaret Garner's story was important for me to pursue because it revealed something that's kind of obvious to us, but we don't talk about as much as historians, that slavery caused trauma. The human responses to that trauma are the main concern of this particular book of mine. Margaret Garner's case underscores the fact that those responses to trauma are not always rational, and nor are those responses always bloodless. Some of them are, in fact, gruesome and incomprehensible, as hers were. The question this book tried to answer is why? Why did Margaret kill, and why did she kill her children? What grievances led this enslaved woman to commit deadly violence against her own children? Was it slavery itself? Was it sexual abuse? Was it a particular set of circumstances and experiences on the farm in which she had been enslaved? Was it the experience of bearing children in slavery with no hope of ever being able to protect them or see them living as free people? Margaret Garner answered this question herself several times in the book. And I excerpted on page 74 in the book. I don't know if you guys have the book, but she basically said that her children were hers, given to her by God, and she was able to do what she wanted with her own children. That's just a summary. So while most people then and now would easily love to paint her with the brush of madness or mental illness, as we call it now, Her words direct historians to her enslaved past about what may have caused her to do this. Why had hope been lost for her that she thought she should take these actions? This book, from which this talk is derived, paints in painstaking detail a picture of what life must have been like for her as a powerless, unprotected, enslaved Black woman who bore 4 children in slavery in Northern Kentucky. And although people would believe that Northern Kentucky yielded an easier life in bondage because the work was certainly less taxing than the work in Mississippi on cotton plantations, or even less grueling than life on rice plantations in South Carolina, but it didn't mean that it was easy for her in Northern Kentucky. The reality of her life is something much grimmer than we would have ever expected. Women like Margaret Garner not only endured various forms of physical and sexual abuse, but were also susceptible to emotional traumas of living under the constant threat of violence, rape, familial separation, persistent racist insults, and other forms of daily degradation. Slavery guaranteed that women like her perpetually lived in a state of vulnerability, fear, physical, and emotional pain. What makes this story different is that it demonstrates that enslaved women did not always endure the damage done quietly and internally, and nor did they always resist covertly and quietly. For example, by just spitting in food or just refusing to go to work. Sometimes their resistance, as this woman's response shows us, erupted violently, outwardly, and publicly in ways that defy comprehension, or in ways that might even prevent our capacity to render sympathy for them. This book, Driven Toward Madness, is concerned with those eruptions of deadly violence and their implications about how slavery damaged Black women's interiors, or in other words, their emotional and psychological well-beings. Unfortunately, psychological and spiritual injuries rarely attract the attention of historians. Because the spirit and soul are considered the realm of the metaphysical, intellectuals often discount or dismiss injuries to them. And it's definitely not something historians even pretend that we do. Yet, there is a direct relationship between the racist and sexist insults, injustice in any form, and psychological injuries. The compounded and multiplied effects of those injuries can murder the soul, as prominent 19th century historian Nell Irvin Painter has attested. Nell Irvin Painter had spent her career as a Princeton historian, a prominent 19th century specialist, as I said. She basically borrowed from the field of psychology, and she used an interpretive framework that she calls soul murder. And so I just basically in this book use her framework of soul murder in order to be able to understand Margaret Garner. And so what soul murder says, according to her, is that these things, sexual abuse, emotional deprivation, physical and mental torture, can be compounded as a series of hurts, the weight of which shatters or wounds the soul. Soul murder then is manifest in several ways: depression, anxiety, self-mutilation, suicide attempts, or what psychologists might classify as post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept of soul murder and my using it is by no means an attempt by me to justify Margaret Garner's actions, but it's just a way to better understand them. For example, by using this framework, one can better understand why she attempted to kill her children instead of Archibald K. Gaines, the man who owned her. nor is the use of soul murder as an intellectual frame an attempt to posthumously psychoanalyze Margaret Garner. I am no psychologist. I don't pretend to be one at night, and I certainly don't pretend to be one in the daytime. But instead, the soul murder conceptual framework simply positions physical, sexual, and mental trauma and abuse as central to this story of slavery, escape, and resistance. That's all it does. So this book also uses Margaret Garner's story to understand or demonstrate how slavery damaged African-American women in their roles as wives and mothers. And as Patricia Hill Collins has argued, she's a Black feminist theorist. She came up with the framework of Black feminist theory. She has argued African-Americans, women's experiences as mothers have been shaped by the dominant group's efforts to harness Black women's sexuality and fertility to a system of capitalist exploitation. In other words, everything about Black women's motherhood was used in order to maximize profit. And so basically, slavery despoiled how Margaret Garner practiced motherhood. It affected her image of herself as a mother, damaged her bonds with her children, denied her the right to protect them as a mother, and even undermined her authority over her own children. In sum, slavery corrupted everything about motherhood and prevented a full expression of the ideas of motherhood for her. And if we use Garner's life as a lens, then we must conclude that slavery also damaged Black marriages and troubled the bonds between family members. So slavery tried its very best to make a mockery of both sets of the Garner's marriages, because what happens in this story is that Margaret Garner is married and she has 4 children. She's pregnant with a 5th, and her husband lives on another farm down the road. Again, they're 16 miles from Cincinnati. Her husband lives on a farm with his parents, and they all escaped together. So there is basically almost nearly intact Black family, which is unheard of on the eve of the Civil War. Most Black families had been destroyed by the pressures of cotton production. And so basically, despite that they're having an intact family, the fact that they didn't live under the same roof was probably, not unusual. But the fact is that her husband didn't really live in the area. He had been hired out or rented out in another part of Kentucky for most of their marriage. And her father-in-law had also been living 25 years in another part of Kentucky, and he had only recently returned to the area when his owner had gotten enough money to go and repurchase him, but by then he was an elderly man. So that's what I mean when I say slavery tried to make a mockery of both sets of the Garner's marriages, and it denied both couples the rights to live under the same roof or to fully enjoy the intimate bonds of marriage when and how they desired. Slavery destroyed the confidence that a child born to a wife was her husband's child, because basically Margaret Garner, there was questions about who fathered her children. I think only 2 of her children, it was certain, belonged to her husband because they were my complexion, they were brown complexion, but the 2 girls were very, very fair in color. And so in fact, so fair that even whites at the time in the North questioned whether or not they could have come from her husband, who was very dark in complexion. And so so there was that question, and that coupled with his persistent absence from her life and from the vicinity just made people wonder whether or not they were in fact the children of her owner instead of her husband. And so there was that. And then her mother-in-law had born a lot of children in slavery. And even though her husband had been sold away from her 25 years earlier, And every one of her children had been sold away from her except for Robert, who was Margaret's husband. So all of that was very complicated, and the paternity of all of these children had been complicated because of the very nature of slavery. So in short, slavery debased Margaret Garner's family inside and out in all the generations of it. Remarkably, the attempt to debase the family was not wholly completed. The Garners managed to have an unbreakable family bond in spite of all of these pressures on the family. In the book, I emphasize the strength of the marriages. The 25 years separation did not end Margaret mother-in-law and father-in-law's marriage. They came together and reunited as if they had never missed a day apart. And in fact, I emphasize in the book how Margaret and her husband, Robert, asserted their rights as father and mother of their children, respectively. And I make Margaret and her husband and her family central to this story. So while other people might make the owners the central to this story, and how the owners were fighting to reclaim her, and the owners were fighting, to get her convicted of murder or whatever else, I make Margaret Garner and her family the central part of my story. In addition, this book is about a powerless Black family that loved themselves enough to escape as an intact family together and to fight as a family unit together when faced with recapture. Regardless of the outcome of the children, we can't be blinded by the fact that they did escape together. And so I thought, that was something that I would emphasize in the book. And in order to fully comprehend why Margaret Garner committed this horrible act, and she did this the morning that she arrived in Cincinnati after traveling all night in the cold of winter. And they crossed the ice on foot because it was solid, frozen solid at the time, before, global warming and stuff. The Ohio River would freeze solid. And so they walked across the river by foot, but they had taken a sleigh to the river, and then they walked across the river, and then they hid in Margaret's cousin's house, not far from the river. And soon after they got there, they were captured. And so, her owner had caught up with her, and that's when she cut her daughter's throat and nearly decapitated her. And, in order to fully understand why she did that and why she did it at that moment, I needed to understand who she was. And so, I had to try to recreate what her life must have been like for her in Kentucky to really understand why she made that decision. And I'll say that her story had completely dropped out of the public consciousness for more than 100 years. And it wasn't until Toni Morrison produced or reintroduced it in her award-winning novel, 1987 novel, Beloved, that we even, remembered this story. The novel, and then Jonathan Demme's 1998 film adaptation with the same name, starring Oprah Winfrey, Danny Glover, and Thandie Newton, helped to raise the public consciousness about this tragic story. And then, there was an English professor who wrote a book about this story, but he focused more on the white family that owned her. And that's what I alluded to earlier. And so mine was the first book written by a Black woman that centers this Black woman and her family. Yet, despite all of this attention with the opera, a film, a book, a novel, despite all of this attention, Margaret Garner remained elusive as a historical subject. Two important and really good historical books preceded mine, and I will say that. One of them was Mark Reinhardt's book, and his is called Who Speaks for Margaret Garner? And it's an edited volume. He has a lot of primary sources in there, and that was indispensable for me. And then there's an edited volume called Gender Resistance, and that was also a collection of essays. So it wasn't a a monograph, as we call it, where you have the same story from beginning to end, but a lot of different essays written by different historians and scholars. The reason it has been difficult for historians to capture the essence of who Margaret Garner was is because she was an uneducated, enslaved Black woman. As such, she left only a faint traditional historical footprint. Okay, so she could not read, she couldn't write, she left no diary and no personal papers. We have just a few little sentences there, here and there, that anyone ever recorded that she said, and I actually record those in my book. None of this was her choice, but it was a consequence of enslavement. I cannot stress enough how difficult it was for me as a historian to even write a paragraph about an enslaved woman who killed her female daughter from her own perspective, much less a whole book, because of the scarcity of sources. You know, historians are driven by sources. If we don't have sources, we can't write. And so it's different than a novelist. And so in order to be able to write this book, I had to subvert the very methodology of my own discipline and embrace the methodology of other disciplines, which is what I did. So this book that I'm talking about provides one example of how we might begin to fill in the gaps and silences in historical sources, not with fiction. Most other people have filled in these gaps and they've written beautiful historical novels on other topics, and this one as well. But to fill in these gaps with traditional and non-traditional historical sources, as well as other disciplines, other methods, and other interpretive frameworks. So that's what I get. That's why I have this soul murder framework. That's why I use Black feminist theory. And that's why I do these really imaginative things, you know, that historians wouldn't technically or traditionally do in order to be able to bring the real life Margaret Garner to the fore. This book just provides one example of how we might put flesh and bones around a Black woman who would otherwise remain an apparition or a ghost in the archive. Okay, so it's not enough for me to say, oh, well, there's not enough sources, therefore I can't write about her. Especially as a Black woman, as a Black woman scholar, it was important for me to persist and tell her story from her perspective. Although Margaret Garner is one of the few runaway slaves who ever testified at his or her own fugitive slave hearing, there are no existing official transcripts of that hearing. They just have been lost. And so I had to rely on the transcription of the proceedings that existed, that people recorded in the local newspapers and other newspaper accounts. I also had to rely on the indictment orders and the requisition orders, as well as the manuscript collection of the owners, including her original owner, John Pollard Gaines. I use interdisciplinary approaches to bring the real life Margaret Garner into sharper focus. And the real life Margaret Garner has very little in common with Setha, Toni Morrison's character. They have very little in common. Anchored in history, this book also makes use of Black feminist theory. I know it's a buzzword now that people have politicized for their own agendas, but Black feminist theory means a lot to a historian of Black women's history. And it really amplifies the experiences of Black women who have historically been written out of history and marginalized and left in footnotes for hundreds of years. So that's why Black feminist theory means something to me. It also makes use of trauma studies, pain studies. I use a little bit of genetics as much as I could understand it, and literary criticism as well. Each of these approaches sews a layer of flesh onto a figure who had been rendered a ghost by the sources and raises the decibels of a voice that had been silenced before and after the murder for 100 years. At the end of the book that I wrote, a real life woman and her proper historical and cultural context emerged, driven toward madness, defied naysayers, and journeyed to some difficult historical places to find the real life Margaret Garner. It may not definitively answer all the questions. In fact, it may have created more questions than I cared to answer. But nonetheless, it gets us a step closer of understanding who she was. More than anything, though, the book should simply serve as a guide for how we might reclaim Black women's voices and their agencies in history when traditional historical sources are non-existent, scarce, damaged, vague, coded, or erased. A Black feminist interpretation of Margaret Garner's life as an enslaved woman, as an enslaved wife, as an enslaved mother, offers a more holistic approach and a holistic picture of who she truly was and what drove her to kill. It rejects the distortions and fictionalized images of her that reduce her to various symbols, all with their own audiences and purposes. To free African Americans and abolitionists at the time, Margaret Garner was the first widely known Black female hero that I've ever come across. She was a hero to free Blacks and to Black women and to abolitionists. She was the first Black woman hero. Her contemporaries believe she had committed armed insurrection. So we see it as her killing her baby, it's an innocent baby, but them living in that moment believe she was the female Nat Turner. She became a potent symbol of slave resistance. Contemporary women's rights advocates, I think we call them feminists today, they tried to insist that she was a women's rights advocate who had killed to protect her daughter's sexual purity, to protect her daughter from a certain future of sexual abuse. Pro-slavery people at the time, Southerners and others, raised her. They believed she was innately evil, that there was something in her character, in her soul that was evil from birth. And they said it in newspapers, okay? So this book examines all of these stereotypes, and it talks about them, and it just, problematizes and historicizes all of these stereotypes, tropes, and tries to unpack them, because all of them are problematic for different reasons. This book allows me to probe slavery's legacy of violence, sexual and physical, as well as psychic trauma, and their capacity to render enslaved Black women mad. And that's the term they used at the time as a synonym for mental illness. I deal with her as a traumatized Black female in historical, social, and political terms. She carried a history of the trauma of slavery, both a personal trauma, collective trauma. She endured all the trauma that her family members had endured, and compounded trauma with her on the journey to freedom the day she escaped. Margaret's history of abuse, enslavement, and denied freedom and humanity burdened her with its full weight as she faced the deepest fears of returning to that life and watching her children grow up in slavery. As Marissa Fuentes has suggested, she's a historian, there is a personal toll that comes from working in what she calls a mortuary of records. And I'm not gonna lie, that's absolutely true. The mortuary of records are records about slavery, broken families, rape, physical abuse, objectification, commodification, and yes, even infanticide. Such topics can have a physiological effect on the body of a historian. There are times when my own body protested too much of this book and the one I just finished, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge. Migraines often prevented me from touching either one of those projects for days or even months on end. Then there's this feeling as if I betrayed my earlier, more optimistic career message that was reflected in my first two books. I took a really dark turn with the Margaret Garner book and then the Brooding Over Bloody Revenge. The first two books focus on free Blacks and focus on redemption and triumph. These were triumphant stories. Those books featured the deliberate activism and agitation of educated free Black Americans and fugitive slaves who tore down slavery and repressive legislation day by day. Margaret Garner was none of those things. And yet the more I researched and wrote about her, the more I respected the distance she traveled, so to speak, for freedom. And it was more than just those 16 miles that night she escaped. In this current era of feminist movement against sexual predators and sexual assault by those with power, this book resonates even more with me. In some of my conclusions in the book, I talk about silences in the case, and now, they seem more plausible now that we know that those who have been victimized by sexual assault often don't ever talk about it. So now we know that, but when I was writing it, it just wasn't clear to me why she had been so silent. But Margaret Garner's biography forced me to rethink motherhood and womanhood in the age of slavery. I reconsidered what constitutes activism. By what standard do we define what is political, abolitionist, feminist, heroic, and especially resistance and freedom? Even more powerfully, this project forced me to really ponder what motherhood means when the choices are not between slavery and freedom for one's children, but when the choices are between slavery and death. We must persist to write about Black women and Black women's history in spite of the limited, fragmented, erased, expunged, and sterilized archive that didn't even think our voices mattered. We must continue to find ways to give voice to those muted by history, to find ways to write from their perspectives. We must subvert or free ourselves from the oft confining traditional historical methodologies and interpretations. Through freeing ourselves as historians, we can liberate the most vulnerable historical actors, like I did with Margaret Garner, and not only expose the abuse they endured, but the resilience of their version and their vision of freedom. Thank you. I want to show you, I have something to share. I did have some images I wanted to show you. This is where she grew up and lived. This is Maplewood in Richwood, Kentucky. This is how it looks today. Probably is how it looked back then. This image on the right is not a slave cabin. I know everybody might think that it is, but it's the remaining structure of the family home of her enslavers. So it's the kitchen. And because there were no slave cabins on these farms in Kentucky, the kitchen is likely where she would have lived and slept. Okay, so she probably did live in the kitchen since she had the double duty of not only working the fields on the left and planting crops, but she also had to cook and clean and wash for the family. So my students always want me to talk at Howard and at other previous schools. Oh, there's house slaves and there's field slaves. I said, it's a little bit more complicated. When people had farms and they only had a few slaves, sometimes they did everything. Like Margaret Garner, she did everything. She was a house slave and a field slave. She worked around the clock perpetually. And this is what a slave cabin would have looked like in that same area back then. This is near Maysville, Kentucky. And this is, remember I said they walked across the ice. So this is a group of people. This is a lot later, but this is just evidence. Like if you didn't believe that the Ohio River used to freeze, because it is nowhere near able to do that anymore. This is people on the Ohio River walking across the ice in 1913. And another one in 1935. And this is the world she would have been looking at in 1856. Cincinnati in 1856. That's when she escaped and killed her daughter. And this is a famous painting, and it is actually the cover of my book. And it's kind of like an inaccurate painting. She did have 2 sons, but she killed a daughter, not a son. So this is like, this would have been a little girl, and the girl was very, very fair, very, very fair. But, and these were her, that's her owner. And then these are the self-styled deputies that helped break into the house when she ended up slitting the little girl's throat, and she bashed the other one in the head with a coal shovel. And this is the courthouse where she would have been tried. And this is, it was memorialized, it's got a marker. Yeah. And this is a mural. Cincinnati's, I really love Cincinnati. They really value history in that city. So they have a mural of her and her family right here down by the river. I don't know if you've ever been to Cincinnati, but that's, I mean, that city, they're really into their history. Not only do they have this, but they also have a monument of another story I wrote about, the Black Brigade. So it's not far from that. So I'm just so proud. When I got to Cincinnati, there was nothing by the Ohio River. Now they have the museum, they have the mural, they have the monument to the Black Brigade. So really proud. And that's it. Thank you so much. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. That sounds like a gargantuan effort to tell Margaret Garner's story, and thank you for doing that. And thank you for sharing a little bit of what it was like for you to do that research, and not just intellectually, but also emotionally. I think that's really important for all of us to know and hear. So thank you. Deb, it looks like you wanted to jump in here.
I just want to, my voice isn't great, but I just wanted to ask you, first of all, I live in Cincinnati, so I agree, I'm proud of this city and what they do in terms of history. You said that she was nothing like the woman that Toni Morrison, who's the focus in Beloved. Could you give a few examples of, because I think for me, that's where I learned the story first was, reading Beloved, and, it was heartrending. And I just wondered, you said, but she was nothing like that person. And I wondered if you could give us a few examples of how it wasn't like that.
Well, yeah, the story is all wrong. And I think, I applaud Toni Morrison for it. She didn't intend to write it like that. She wanted to give depth and breadth to Setha. And so, they just had a different story. Margaret Garner was never haunted by, a ghost, and she didn't live as a free woman in Cincinnati. She never got that gift. And so when she killed her daughter, she was in a Cincinnati jail for a period of time, and then she was whisked away under cover of night by her owner and sold down the Mississippi, and died of typhoid shortly thereafter. But not before her kids and her were thrown into the Ohio River, and another daughter died, drowned in the Ohio River. So it's just so much tragedy that happened to her. But she also, wasn't dating and didn't have this guy she's dating. Her husband and her stayed married until she died. And so there's that. And, she just, was by all intents and purposes, her character, her personality was just a lot different. And so, it just, I guess they had to add texture and flavor to make it, entertainment. And to give it depth. And I don't have that luxury as a historian. So people often say, well, why didn't you add more? Why didn't you tell more about her marriage? We can only talk about what we have. And oftentimes we don't have enough to give a lot of the details. So yeah, their stories were substantively different, and she was left with no daughters. And so there was no daughter that was, with her living in Cincinnati. And so, yeah.
Before we close tonight, I want to thank you again, Dr. Taylor, for being with us tonight, and for sharing Margaret Garner's story, but also through that, sharing your story of writing that book. It's just been a privilege to hear that from you. So thank you very much.